When we talk about generations, it almost always feels like this big showdown between two giants. You've got the baby boomers in one corner and the millennials in the other. Their values, their work ethic, it's like that's the only conversation happening. But what about the millions and millions of people who grew up right in their shadow? Well, today we're going to unpack the story of those often overlooked generations caught right there in the middle. So, first, let's just set the stage a little bit with the two generations that, let's be honest, get all the attention. These are the two loud voices that kind of represent opposite ends of the last century and this one. So on one side, you have the baby boomers, right? They were shaped by all that post-war optimism and this really strong sense of loyalty to their employers. And then on the other side, you've got the millennials. They came of age during some pretty tough economic times and really value things like flexibility and purpose in their work. The whole cultural story often just pits these two against each other. But with all the focus on these two, it really makes you wonder, right? Who are the people that were born in that gap? Are they just one group, or is there something else going on? Well, it turns out there isn't just one forgotten generation stuck in the middle. There are actually two distinct groups, and each one has its own unique identity that was forged by a totally different set of experiences. Meet the generational middle children, Generation Jones and Generation X. Okay, so let's get our bearings here for a second. This timeline shows us exactly where everyone fits. Generation Jones, they're technically the younger half of the baby boom, born from 1954 to 65. And then, right after them, from 1965 to 1980, you get Generation X, who are literally sandwiched right between the boomers and the millennials. And the name itself, Generation Jones, is kind of perfect. It perfectly captures how this group felt. They saw all the prosperity and the big cultural moments that the early boomers got to have, but they felt like they just missed the party. They were jonesing for it, that deep, unfulfilled craving. Just think about it. While their older brothers and sisters were at Woodstock, this generation was still in elementary school. Their big formative years weren't defined by the summer of love, but by political scandals, huge gas lines, and a struggling economy. And then right on their heels came Generation X. Their whole childhood experience was defined by independence, but not really by choice. I mean, with divorce rates going up and more women joining the workforce, they became the original latchkey kids, just learning to fend for themselves from a really young age. Now, this cynical, self-reliant mindset, it didn't just appear out of thin air. It was forged in the fire of one crisis after another, which taught these middle generations a really important lesson. You can't trust the system. For Gen Jones, their childhood was marked by this 1-2 punch of Watergate, which completely shattered their trust in government, and then the oil crisis, which shattered their trust in the economy. And then for Gen X, coming of age in the 80s, the hits just kept on coming. You had the Reagan recession, which made corporate layoffs feel normal, basically erasing that whole idea of a job for life. And then a whole new crisis emerged that would shake their sense of personal safety to its core. This quote just nails the emotional shift, doesn't it? Where the early boomers saw a world full of possibilities, Generation Jones saw a world of broken promises. All that idealism of the 60s had basically just curdled into the skepticism of the 70s and 80s. And for Gen X, this feeling of distrust was made so much worse by a public health crisis that brought fear right into their personal lives and relationships, right when they were coming of age. I mean, that is a stark and incredibly powerful reality. The AIDS epidemic showed up just as they were navigating puberty and young adulthood. This wasn't some abstract threat on the news. It was a terrifying new part of the equation of life and love and intimacy. And the scale of this loss, it was just staggering. This number represents friends, cousins, siblings, mentors. These weren't just statistics. They were empty seats at the dinner table. And they were often surrounded by this wall of silence and shame that made grieving almost impossible. So all of this constant exposure to crisis, mixed with a serious lack of adult supervision, created a very specific psychological profile, especially for Gen X, something you could call radical self-reliance. And this figured-out-yourself mentality really became a double-edged sword. On the one hand, yeah, it made them incredibly resourceful, adaptable, and resilient people. But on the other hand, it created this deep fear of being vulnerable, a real difficulty in asking for help, and this profound sense of just emotional solitude. Wow. This quote from a Gen Xer in counseling just cuts right to the heart of it all. It's the core conflict of the latchkey generation. Totally competent and capable on the outside, but often carrying this quiet, heavy burden of loneliness on the inside.
So, what happened when these cynical, self reliant kids grew up and stepped into the professional world? Well, they didn't make a lot of noise about it, but they quietly started a revolution that completely reshaped the modern workplace.
For a generation so often called forgotten or slackers, guess what? They are overwhelmingly in charge now. More than half of the CEOs in the Fortune 500 today are from Generation X. The latchkey kids are running the show. And you can totally see their upbringing reflected in how they lead. They saw that corporate loyalty was a one-way street, so of course they championed work-life balance. They believe in results, not just paying your dues, which led to a focus on meritocracy. They grew up bridging the analog and digital worlds, so they're super adaptable. And because they were raised to be independent, they trust their teams to just get the job done. So after all this, why does understanding these forgotten middle generations matter so much right now? It's because they are the essential bridge. They experienced a world without the internet, but they were also young enough to be early adopters of all the new tech. They're the ones who translated the old, rigid rules of the boomer workplace into the flexible, balanced, and results-driven systems that millennials and Gen Z just expect today. They quietly built the very bedrock of the modern office. And that leaves us with this one last kind of provocative thought. In a culture that is so obsessed with the loudest voices in the room, what if it's the quiet, pragmatic, and resilient middle children of history who ended up having the most profound and lasting impact of all?